today we will be looking at a concept in social psychology which is known as prejudice and discrimination. In this concept, we will be looking at nature and definition of prejudice, so prejudice, stereotype and discrimination, origin of prejudice, sources of prejudice, elements of prejudice, characteristics of prejudice, prejudice in relation to environment and social distance. Now coming to the nature and definition of prejudice. Prejudice is a negative emotional response based on a group membership. The term prejudice is originated from the Latin word called prejudicium, which means judgment. And according to Alport, in the year 1954, he says prejudice is seen as an antipathy based on a faulty or inflexible generalization. He argued that two elements must constitute the definition of prejudice. One, being the attitude of favor or disfavor, and the other being an overgeneralized erroneous belief. And Lyons in the year 2001, he says prejudice corresponds to cognitive beliefs, affect and discriminatory behaviors towards the members of a group on an account of the membership to their group. And Capezzoa and Volpetto in the year 1996 says stereotype is the cognitive component, and frequently prejudices refer to negative feelings associated to a particular group. Prejudice is experiencing the negative feelings or thoughts about the people in the group which one dislikes, and prejudices are related to many emotions like fear, anger, envy, guilt or disgust. For example, the primary negative emotional response toward gay men is disgust. What comes to your mind if a person comes across, if a gay person comes and stands in front of you, how do you respond? What are the emotions that go on in you? And research suggests that generating negative emotions can actively lead to discrimination. Prejudice can have a strong influence on how people behave and interact with others, particularly with those who are different from them. And also at times it could be unconsciously or without the person realizing they are under the influence of their internalized prejudices. And prejudice involves assumptions and intentions about members of a specific group which propose that the members of the group have certain features and behavior patterns. Certain few common features of prejudice include negative feelings, stereotyped beliefs, and a tendency to discriminate against members of a group. In a society, we often see prejudices towards a group based on race, sex, religion, culture, and more. So now we look at the differences between prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. How prejudice is different from either of the other two. Coming to prejudice, according to Gordon Alport, he says prejudice is a feeling which is favorable or unfavorable toward a person or thing prior to or not based on actual experience. Stereotyping is where a collection of trait names upon which a large percentage of people agree as appropriate for describing some sort of individuals. Then moving on to discrimination. It is the unfair or prejudicial treatment of people and groups based on characteristics such as race, gender, age or sexual orientation. prejudice, stereotyping and discrimination often go hand in hand, but it is also possible to have one without the others. When an ethnic group is stereotyped with a neutral or positive attribute such as family-oriented prejudice, and discrimination may not be involved. Similarly, a generalized prejudice against foreigners or amputees may not include specific stereotypes or acts of discrimination. There may be times when discrimination takes place without prejudice or stereotyping, either intentionally or unintentionally. Now we will look at the origin of prejudice. Prejudice stems from a threat, either material or symbolic, according to S.S. Jackson and Bennett in 2010. Threat arises from the fear that one needs would be undermined by another, which has an effect on one's self-esteem. According to a cross-cultural study of 186 different societies, the more loyal a group is towards their own, the more they turn negative to the other groups. When one's identity or group identity is threatened, then one's self-esteem is also at stake. And research suggests that the more a group is prejudiced towards outgroup, the more the group turns to in-group. Research also suggests that holding negative views about the outgroups, in-groups enhance the image of the outgroup. Threat plays an important role in aggravating or reducing prejudice. And according to Allport, there are three-stage theory of prejudice formation. One is pre-generalization, puberty and third stage. Pre-generalization is middle childhood. Children are generally aware of differences but do not categorize others or have strong feelings toward other groups. Early puberty is where there is a total rejection of outgroups peaks at this stage. Adolescence thinking becomes more differentiated and less generalized. According to Bobo, conflict can be a cause of prejudice. When there is competition among groups, prejudice increases. Realistic conflict theory suggests that when there is a competition, members of the group view each other in a negative way. A feeling of being morally superior to the other group creeps in, and this can escalate prejudice. And according to 𝗪𝗏 and a social identity theory suggests that individuals tend to feel happy when they belong to a particular group. Social identity theory is built on three key cognitive components. One, social categorization. Second, social identification. And the third, social comparison. Coming to social categorization. It is a process by which we recognize individuals into social groups in order to understand our social world. This enables to define people on the basis of the groups to which an individual belongs. It is based on the social categories more than the individual characteristics. Social categorization generally results in an emphasis on the similarities of people in the same group and the differences between people in separate groups. One can belong to a variety of social categories, but different categories will be more or less important depending on social circumstances. For example, a person can define themselves as a business executive, an animal lover, and a devoted aunt. But those identities will only come up if they are relevant to the social situation. The second process is called social identification, which is the process of identifying as a group member. Socially identification with a group leads individuals to behave in the way that they believe members of that group should behave. For example, if an individual defines herself as an environmentalist, she may try to conserve water, recycle whenever possible, and march in rallies for climate change awareness. Through this process, people become emotionally invested in their group memberships, and consequently their self-esteem is impacted by the status of their groups. Now, coming to the third process, which is social comparison. It is a process by which people compare their group with other groups in terms of prestige and social standing. In order to maintain self-esteem, one must perceive his or her in-group as having a higher social standing than an out-group. One's self-esteem is enhanced by being a part of the group. For example, sports team, religious groups, and occupations. Memberships in various groups enhance one's identity and a sense of belongingness. If a positive evaluation of one's in-group is not possible, individuals will generally employ one of the three strategies, and we'll look at what these three strategies are. First one, individual mobility. When an individual does not view her group favorably, she can attempt to leave the current group and join one with a higher social standing. Of course, this won't alter the status of the group, but it can alter the status of the individual. Second, social creativity. In-group members can enhance the social standing of their existing group by adjusting some element of the between group comparison. This can be accomplished by choosing a different dimension on which to compare the two groups, or by adjusting value judgments so that what was once thought to be negative is considered positive. Another opinion is to compare the in-group to a different out-group, specifically an out-group that has a lower social status. And social competition in in-group members can attempt to enhance the group social status by collectively working to improve their situation. In this case, the in-group competes directly with an out-group with the objective of reversing the group's social positions on one or more dimensions. So, when we look at these three aspects an individual would employ in going about enhancing one's group. So, brain is involved in developing prejudice. In the brain, amygdala is found to be positively correlated with indirect measures of racial attitudes. And coming to, there are two types of prejudice, implicit and explicit prejudice. Implicit prejudice refers to the thoughts that enter one's mind unconsciously. They exist and influence one's behavior, but people who are holding it may not be aware of the impact. One way to measure prejudice is through priming. Priming is where exposure to certain stimuli or events or the information that is held in memory makes it easier to bring to mind or to more available to influence one's current reactions. An explicit prejudice refers to the thoughts that occur consciously. Example, blacks and whites. An emotion that is experienced when the group is confronted with the harmful actions done by another group is known as collective guilt. And derogation of the victims helps perpetrators to feel less burden when they do any harm. And motivated forgetting can help an individual to maintain a favorable attitude in the group. Now we will look at sources of prejudice, and some of the sources are racism. Racism is a dominant source when it comes to prejudice. It is a view that one particular race is greater than the other and that the features are fixed and unique. Racism related psychological injuries have been shown to increase stress, trauma, anxiety, fear, anger, depression, while reducing overall quality of life for African Americans. Experiences of racism may promote both external shame and internal shame. External shame has been shown to promote psychological distress that stems from unmet needs for communal and favorable social spaces. Internalized shame may not be fully encompass the extent to which African Americans experience. Now moving on to the another source of prejudice, sexism. It is a discrimination based on gender, especially against girls and women. Killing of a girl child is still prevalent in certain interior parts of India. High levels of hostile and benevolent sexist attitudes were held by Indian men. Men's hostile sexism involved insecurities about dependence, producing perceptions that female partners are less dependable than they actually are. Now moving on to another source is ageism. It is a bias towards the geriatric population, mainly the elderly. The term ageism was first coined in the year 1969 when it was recognized that prejudice was based on age, which was a common occurrence. Older persons who were less educated were particularly likely to experience adverse health effects of ageism. Evidence of ageism was found across the age, sex, and race and ethnicity of the targeters, for instance, like people perpetrating ageism. For about 82% of Americans who are 50 and older say they have experienced prejudice, discrimination, and stereotyping based on their age. Next source is classism. Classism discrimination based on one's social class or status. In developing economies, if the states enacted that the dominant and subordinate individuals relinquished their almost segregated state, this would lead to a redistribution of wealth and power. Our next source of prejudice is homophobia. It is an unreasonable fear of homosexuals. The term internalized phobia is the negative and distressing thoughts and feelings experienced by lesbians and gay men about their sexuality and which are attributed to experiences of cultural heterosexism and victimization. Homophobia is related to heightened levels of masculinity and may develop in men who feel threatened by individuals whom they perceive to have feminine characteristics. Our next source of prejudice is nationalism. Nationalism is the outlook that is based on one's loyalty for the nation which supersedes the other person's interest. Collective narcissism is compensatory, serving neither out-group nor in-group members. Instead, it serves individuals' own psychological needs by providing an accessible group-based ego enhancement strategy. A next source of prejudice is religious prejudice. It is a negative attitude or behavior among different religious groups because their views are different from others. So, the last source of prejudice is xenophobia. It is defined as unreasonable fear of foreigners or foreign things. In the time of pandemic, found that anti-Asian attitudes were activated and were associated with a variety of COVID-19 attitudes and behaviors in the early stages of the pandemic, and that anti-Asian attitudes are associated with not just concern about the virus but also with xenophobic behaviors and policy preferences. So, moving on to the elements of prejudice. So, there are three types of elements in prejudice: cognitive element, affective element, and behavioral element. So, first one is cognitive element, and it involves the beliefs held about a particular group. These beliefs are in the form of stereotyping, common but very simple views of what particular groups of people are like. The second one is affective element. So, affective component involves the feelings experienced in response to the group. If an individual is prejudiced against another group, they would experience fear, anger, disgust, apathy when they come face to face with the other group. The third component is behavioral element. The term behavior involves action. For anything to be called as a behavior, it needs to be specific, measurable, and observable. When it has all three, then I call it as a behavior. Now we move on to the characteristics of prejudice. First characteristic of prejudice, it is acquired. When I say prejudice is acquired, it means it is learnt. For example, a child learns by imitating his or her parents and people whom she or he likes and dislikes. A child observes, watches, and then acts. The second characteristic of prejudice is emotional overtones. When I say emotional overtone, it means either too exaggerated emotion or too less, but it is always over. And prejudice is followed by an emotion. If a group like a particular person, then they would exhibit feelings of happiness, joy, love, affection, and care. If they do not like, they would exhibit the feelings of anger, disgust, hatred, hostility, and envy. The third characteristic of prejudice is irrational. Prejudice does not always result in logic and wisdom. People engage in acts without looking into the facts and mostly without any reason. Even if facts are placed, they would not believe but go ahead with what the group is doing. And the next characteristic of prejudice is functional. Prejudice aids an individual to stick to their beliefs and defend their views. It strengthens one's esteem and dignity while doing so. And the next characteristic of prejudice is baseless. So, prejudice is not based on facts and it is not based on any personal experience. Now, we'll move on to how prejudice is related to environment and social distance. Environment has an effect on a prejudice. A person or a situation might lead to direct experience. Environmental racism is a more frequent setting of environmentally hazardous industries in predominantly minority communities. Environmental racism arises from poverty and not racism. Social distance can be positive or negative towards a group. Now we'll look at the summary in prejudice and discrimination. Throughout human existence, prejudice has been a powerful agent in either bringing about a change in an individual or in destroying one's life. Prejudice arises out of a negative emotional response. Prejudice originates when there is a threat to one's group. It has an effect on one's identity and self-esteem. Some of the sources of the prejudice includes racism, nationalism, religious groups, and xenophobia. Prejudice is not only a behavioral but also includes emotional and cognitive component. Under understanding the attributes and the kind of effects it would have on the individual, it would help one to be a better individual in the society.